Number 1. Dean Corll. During the early 1970s, the working-class neighborhoods of Houston were filled with families who believed their communities were safe places to raise children. Teenagers rode bicycles through the streets, played basketball in empty lots, and spent long afternoons visiting friends. But between 1970 and 1973, something deeply disturbing began happening in these neighborhoods. Teenage boys started disappearing. At first, each disappearance seemed like an isolated case. Parents believed their children might have run away or left town with friends. Police often assumed the same thing, since teenagers occasionally left home voluntarily. But as the number of missing boys grew, fear slowly spread across the city. What investigators eventually uncovered would become one of the most horrifying serial murder cases in American history. At the center of the nightmare was Dean Corll, the man known as the Candyman. Dean Corll was born in 1939 in Fort Wayne, but his family eventually moved to Houston, where he spent most of his life. As a child, Corll was described as quiet and polite. He did reasonably well in school and rarely attracted negative attention. After graduating, he served briefly in the U.S. Army before returning to Houston. When Corll came back to the city, he began working for his family's candy business. His mother owned a small candy factory in the Houston Heights area, where Corll helped produce and distribute sweets to local stores. Because he had easy access to candy and snacks, Corll frequently gave them away to neighborhood teenagers. Local boys often stopped by the candy factory to talk, eat sweets, and socialize. Over time, this behavior earned Corll a nickname among neighborhood kids. They began calling him the Candyman. At the time, the nickname seemed harmless, but in reality, Corll was using his friendly reputation to gain the trust of young boys in the neighborhood. The disappearances begin in September 1970. A teenager named Jeffrey Connon disappeared after leaving his home in Houston. His parents reported him missing, but police initially believed he might have run away. Just months later, another boy vanished, then another, and another. Families across the Houston area were left waiting for phone calls or clues that never came. The missing teenagers included boys from different neighborhoods, but many of them had something in common. They were last seen near Houston Heights, the same area where Dean Corll lived and worked. Despite this connection, investigators had no evidence linking the disappearances together. Meanwhile, Corll continued living his life normally, but he was not acting alone. The teenage accomplices to teenagers eventually became deeply involved in Corll's crimes. Elmer Wayne Henley, David Owen Brooks, both boys lived in the same Houston neighborhoods where the victims disappeared. Corll befriended them and gradually gained their loyalty. At first, their relationship seemed like a friendship between an adult and teenagers who admired him, but over time, Corll manipulated them into helping him lure other boys to his home. Henley and Brooks often invited friends to parties, promising alcohol, marijuana, or other activities that might attract teenage boys. The victims had no idea they were walking into a deadly trap. The torture chamber. One of the most disturbing discoveries in the investigation was what police later found inside Corll's home. Investigators discovered a wooden board fitted with handcuffs and restraints. Authorities later referred to it as a torture board. Victims were tied to the board and subjected to horrific abuse before being murdered. The brutality of the crimes shocked even experienced detectives. Corll used various methods to kill his victims, including strangulation and shootings. After the murders, he and his accomplices buried the bodies in several locations around Houston. These locations included boat storage, sheds, remote beaches, woodland areas outside the city. For years, the crimes remained hidden. Parents searched desperately for their missing children while the killer responsible lived quietly among them. The night everything changed, the case might have continued even longer if not for an event that occurred on August 8, 1973. On that night, Elmer Wayne Henley brought two friends to Corll's house for what he believed would be a party. At some point during the evening, Corll unexpectedly attacked and tied up the teenagers. Henley himself was also restrained, but during the chaos, Henley managed to free himself. A confrontation followed. Realizing that Corll intended to kill everyone in the room, Henley grabbed a pistol. He fired several shots at Dean Corll, killing him instantly. Henley then contacted police and told them a story so horrifying that officers initially struggled to believe it. He claimed that Corll had murdered dozens of boys. The mass grave investigation. When police began investigating Henley's claims, they quickly realized the situation was far worse than anyone had imagined. Henley led detectives to several burial sites, The first was a rented boat storage facility where Corll had buried victims. As officers began digging, they made a shocking discovery: human remains. Then more and more. Over the following days, investigators uncovered body after body. The search expanded to additional locations outside Houston. Eventually, authorities discovered 28 victims, making the case one of the largest serial murder investigations in American history at the time. The crimes became known as the Houston mass murders. Most of the victims were teenage boys between the ages of 13 and 20. Many came from working-class families. Some had been reported missing for years. Others had disappeared so long ago that many people believed they would never be found. For the families, the discoveries brought a mixture of grief and closure. Parents who had spent years wondering what happened to their children finally learned the terrible truth. The trial of the accomplices with Corll dead, attention turned to his accomplices. Both Elmer Wayne Henley and David Owen Brooks were arrested and charged with multiple murders. During their trials, prosecutors presented evidence showing how the two teenagers had helped Corll lure victims. Henley and Brooks admitted their involvement, but claimed that Corll had manipulated and threatened them. Despite these claims, juries found both men guilty. Henley received 6 life sentences, while Brooks was also sentenced to life in prison. The lasting impact, the discovery of the Houston mass murders, shocked the nation. Communities across the United States realized how easily a serial killer had been able to hide his crimes for years. Parents became more cautious about where their children went and who they trusted. The case also changed how police investigated missing person reports involving teenagers. Before this case, many departments assumed missing teens had simply run away. Afterward, investigators began taking such reports far more seriously. Remembering the victims today, the story of Dean Corll remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of Texas. The crimes destroyed dozens of families and left a permanent scar on the community of Houston. While the killer himself died before facing trial, the full truth of his actions eventually came to light, and the victims, young boys whose lives were taken far too soon, are remembered as the true focus of this tragic chapter in American criminal history. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 2. Henry Lee Lucas. In the long and disturbing history of crime in Texas, few cases have generated as much confusion, controversy, and fear as the story of Henry Lee Lucas. For a time during the 1980s, Lucas was believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in history. Investigators initially thought he might have been responsible for hundreds of murders across the United States. Newspapers described him as a wandering killer who traveled from state to state, leaving bodies behind him wherever he went. But as the investigation unfolded, the truth became far more complicated. Lucas had indeed committed brutal murders. However, the shocking number of killings he confessed to would later become one of the most controversial episodes in the history of American criminal investigations. A troubled childhood. Henry Lee Lucas was born in 1936 in Blacksburg, into a deeply troubled and violent household. His mother, Viola Lucas, was widely described as abusive and neglectful. According to many accounts, Lucas grew up surrounded by violence, alcoholism, and poverty. His father frequently drank heavily and was often beaten by Lucas's mother during domestic arguments. The chaotic environment left a lasting psychological impact on Lucas. As a child, he suffered several serious injuries. One of these injuries caused the loss of an eye, giving him a distinctive appearance that later made him recognizable in police photographs. Lucas struggled in school and eventually dropped out. Throughout his early life, he drifted between jobs and locations, rarely maintaining stable relationships. By his teenage years, his behavior had already begun attracting the attention of law enforcement. The first murder. Lucas committed his first known killing in 1960. During an argument with his mother, Viola Lucas, the confrontation escalated violently. Lucas stabbed her in the neck, killing her. He was arrested and convicted of murder, eventually receiving a lengthy prison sentence. However, after serving about 10 years, Lucas was released on parole. His release would mark the beginning of a far more disturbing chapter in his life. Life on the road. After leaving prison, Lucas began living a nomadic lifestyle. He traveled frequently across the southern United States, often moving between small towns and rural communities. During this period, he met Otis Toole, another drifter who would later become infamous in his own right. The two men formed a strange and deeply disturbing friendship. Both were unstable, violent individuals who shared stories about criminal activities and violent fantasies. Authorities would later believe that Lucas and Toole were responsible for several murders during their time together. However, determining the exact number of victims proved extremely difficult. The arrest that changed everything in 1983. Lucas was living in Round Rock, a small city near Austin. At the time, he was staying with a woman named Kate Rich. Lucas had been working for Rich as a handyman, but one day, Rich's elderly mother disappeared. Police soon discovered that Lucas had murdered her. The victim, Becky Powell, had been brutally killed and dismembered. Lucas was arrested shortly afterward. At first, investigators believed they had captured a murderer responsible for a single crime. But during interrogation, Lucas began making astonishing claims. He told detectives that he had murdered dozens of people across multiple states. Then he said the number was higher. Soon, Lucas was claiming responsibility for hundreds of murders. The confessions over the next several months, Lucas participated in countless interviews with investigators. He described murders in vivid detail. He claimed to have killed victims in Texas, Florida, California, and many other states. Police departments across the country began contacting Texas investigators to ask whether Lucas might be responsible for their unsolved murder cases. For a time, it seemed possible that Lucas might truly be one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The Texas Rangers created a special task force to investigate his claims. Detectives traveled across the country, verifying Lucas's confessions. Eventually, authorities announced that Lucas had confessed to more than 600 murders. The story made national headlines. News reports described Lucas as a traveling killer who moved constantly, leaving bodies behind him wherever he went. The growing doubts, but as investigators continued examining Lucas's claims, serious problems began to appear. Some of the murders he confessed to had occurred in places where Lucas could not possibly have been. In other cases, the victims had died while Lucas was already in prison. Travel records also showed that Lucas would have needed to drive impossible distances within short periods of time in order to commit all the murders he claimed. Gradually, investigators realized something troubling. Lucas had been fabricating many of his confessions. Some detectives believed he was motivated by the attention he received during interviews. Others suggested that investigators may have unintentionally encouraged false confessions by providing information during questioning. Whatever the reason, the number of confirmed murders connected to Lucas began shrinking dramatically. The confirmed crimes, despite the false confessions, Lucas was still responsible for several brutal murders. Among the confirmed victims was Deborah Jackson, a young woman whose body was discovered along a highway in Georgetown. For years, investigators referred to her only as Orange Socks because of the clothing she wore when her body was found. Lucas eventually confessed to killing her. Decades later, modern DNA testing confirmed the victim's identity and helped verify parts of the case. The trial and sentence in 1984. Henry Lee Lucas was convicted of murder in Texas. The court sentenced him to death. However, years later the sentence was commuted to life imprisonment after serious doubts emerged about the reliability of many confessions connected to the investigation. The case became a major lesson in the dangers of relying too heavily on confessions without strong physical evidence. The legacy of the case, the story of Henry Lee Lucas, remains one of the most controversial chapters in American criminal history. For a time, he was believed to be the most prolific serial killer ever captured, but the truth turned out to be far more complicated. Lucas had committed horrific crimes, yet many of the murders he claimed were never actually his. The investigation forced law enforcement agencies to rethink how they handled confessions and unsolved cases. Today, Lucas's story is studied in criminal justice courses as an example of how investigations can sometimes be influenced by pressure, media attention, and the desire to solve difficult cases. The final years Henry Lee Lucas spent the rest of his life in prison. He died in 2001 while incarcerated in Huntsville Unit. Even after his death, debates about his crimes continue. Some investigators believe there may still be victims connected to Lucas who are never officially confirmed. Others argue that the case represents one of the largest examples of false confessions in criminal justice history. Either way, the story remains one of the most disturbing and complicated criminal cases ever connected to Texas. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 3. Kenneth McDuff. Among the many disturbing criminal cases connected to Texas, the story of Kenneth McDuff stands out for a chilling reason. Unlike many serial killers who are eventually captured and imprisoned for life, McDuff was convicted of horrific murders, sentenced to death, and then released back into society. After regaining his freedom, he began killing again. The case shocked the public and exposed serious flaws in the criminal justice system, raising questions about prison overcrowding, parole policies, and the dangers of releasing violent offenders. Early life. Kenneth Allen McDuff was born in 1946 in Rosebud, a small rural town located about 40 miles south of Waco. He grew up in a troubled environment dominated by his mother, Addie McDuff, who was widely described as extremely controlling and aggressive. Neighbors later reported that Addie McDuff often defended her son regardless of his behavior, even when he became involved in fights or criminal activity. As a teenager, McDuff already displayed troubling tendencies. He was frequently involved in confrontations and reportedly enjoyed intimidating others. Despite these warning signs, few people in the community could have imagined the violent crimes he would eventually commit. The 1966 murders. On the night of August 6, 1966, 3 teenagers were spending time together near Temple. The victims were Edna Sullivan, Robert Brand, Mark Dunham. They were parked near a lake outside town, talking and enjoying a quiet evening. Suddenly, Kenneth McDuff approached their car with a firearm. He forced the teenagers out of the vehicle and tied them up. The situation quickly turned violent. McDuff shot Robert Brand and Mark Dunham, killing them. He then kidnapped Edna Sullivan. What happened next became one of the most disturbing parts of the case. McDuff drove Sullivan to a remote area where he assaulted her and murdered her in a brutal manner that later led investigators to nickname him the Broomstick Killer. When the bodies were discovered, the brutality of the crime shocked the entire region. The small communities around Temple and Waco were devastated. Arrest and trial authorities quickly focused their investigation on Kenneth McDuff. Witnesses reported seeing his car near the crime scene. Soon after, police arrested him. During the trial, prosecutors presented strong evidence linking McDuff to the murders. The jury found him guilty. In 1966, the court sentenced him to death by electric chair. For the families of the victims, the sentence seemed to ensure that McDuff would never harm anyone again. But the story was far from over. The sentences reduced during the early 1970s. Several legal decisions across the United States temporarily halted executions. As a result, many death sentences were automatically converted to life imprisonment. McDuff's sentence was reduced to life in prison. At the time, many people assumed that a life sentence meant he would remain behind bars forever. But a few years later, another controversial policy created an unexpected opportunity for McDuff. Prison overcrowding and release. By the late 1980s, prisons across Texas were facing severe overcrowding. To address the problem, officials began granting early release to certain inmates who were considered low risk. Shockingly, Kenneth McDuff became eligible for parole. In 1989, after serving roughly 23 years in prison, he was released. The decision outraged many people once the public learned about it. A man convicted of a brutal triple murder had been allowed to walk free. But the worst consequences of that decision had yet to unfold. A new wave of murders. After leaving prison, McDuff returned to the area around Waco. At first, he attempted to live quietly, but within a short time, women in the region began disappearing. Several of the victims were young women working in convenience stores. One of the most well-known victims was Melissa Northrup, who vanished while working at a gas station in Waco. In 1992, her disappearance triggered a massive search effort. Eventually, investigators discovered that McDuff had abducted and murdered her. As police continued their investigation, they uncovered evidence linking him to several other murders. Authorities realized that the man once sentenced to death had returned to society and resumed killing. The manhunt. Once investigators connected McDuff to the new murders, he quickly became one of the most wanted fugitives in the country. The Federal Bureau of Investigation added him to their 10 most wanted fugitives list. The search for McDuff intensified across multiple states. Law enforcement agencies distributed wanted posters and broadcast his image across national news programs. After several months on the run, McDuff was finally located in Kansas City. He was arrested in 1992. Final conviction during the trial that followed. prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence connecting Kenneth McDuff to the murder of Melissa Northrup and other crimes. The jury found him guilty. This time, the court once again sentenced him to death. Unlike the earlier sentence, this one would ultimately be carried out. Execution on November 17, 1998. Kenneth McDuff was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. His execution ended one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the history of Texas. Lasting impact. The McDuff case had a profound impact on the criminal justice system. Many people questioned how a convicted triple murderer could have been released from prison in the first place. The case led to reforms in parole policies and increased scrutiny of early release programs. For the families of the victims, however, those changes could never undo the damage that had already been done. The loss of their loved ones was permanent. Remembering the victims, the story of Kenneth McDuff remains one of the most disturbing examples of how failures in the justice system can lead to tragic consequences. A man once condemned for brutal murder was allowed to return to society, and when he did, more innocent lives were lost. Today, the case continues to be studied as a cautionary example of the dangers of releasing violent offenders without fully understanding the risks they pose. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 4. Angel Maturino Reséndiz. In the late 1990s, a wave of brutal murders began spreading across several states in the United States. The crimes seemed random and unpredictable, leaving investigators confused and communities terrified. Victims were found murdered inside their homes, often located near railroad tracks. There were few witnesses and very little physical evidence, but investigators soon realized something strange about the pattern of the crimes. The killer appeared to be traveling from city to city using freight trains. The man responsible for these attacks would eventually become known as the Railroad Killer. His real name was Angel Maturino. Early life. Angel Maturino Reséndiz was born in 1959 in Puebla. He grew up in a poor rural environment and experienced a difficult childhood. Reséndiz later claimed that he suffered a serious head injury as a young boy when he fell from a tree. Some experts later suggested that this injury may have affected his mental health and behavior later in life. As he grew older, Reséndiz began crossing the border into the United States illegally. He traveled frequently between Mexico and the United States, often riding freight trains across long distances. This unusual method of travel would later become a key part of his crimes. Life along the railroads. By the 1990s, Reséndiz had adopted a nomadic lifestyle. He moved constantly between cities across Texas and other states. Instead of using buses or cars, he traveled by secretly boarding freight trains. Railroad systems connect hundreds of cities across North America, allowing trains to travel thousands of miles. By using these trains, Reséndiz could move long distances without leaving clear travel records. This made it extremely difficult for police to track him. Investigators later realized that many of his victims lived within walking distance of railway lines. After arriving in a city, Reséndiz would leave the train yard and wander into nearby neighborhoods. Then he would select a house at random. The first known murders. One of the earliest confirmed victims was Michael White, who was murdered in Lexington in 1997. White was attacked inside his home located near railroad tracks. Police initially believed the crime might have been a burglary gone wrong, but similar murders soon followed in other states. The killer often used blunt objects such as hammers or heavy tools to attack his victims. In many cases, he broke into homes during the night and attacked people while they slept. The violence was sudden and extremely brutal. The Texas murders. Several of the most disturbing crimes occurred in Texas. In 1998, a tragic murder occurred in Houston. The victim was Claudia Benton, a respected pediatric neurologist. She was found murdered inside her home after a violent attack. The brutality of the crime shocked the community. Soon afterward, more murders were discovered near railroad lines in different cities. Each crime scene showed similarities. Homes located near train tracks, victims attacked with blunt objects, evidence of burglary. Investigators slowly began realizing that these crimes might be connected, but identifying the killer remained extremely difficult. The university professor murder. One of the most shocking cases occurred in 1998, when Noemi Dominguez, a young college student, was killed in Houston. The murder stunned the community and drew national attention. As the investigation expanded, authorities began comparing evidence from multiple states. They eventually realized that the same person might be responsible for a series of murders across the country. The media soon began calling the unknown suspect the railroad killer. The manhunt. By 1999, investigators had identified Angel Maturino Reséndiz as the primary suspect. His fingerprints had been found at several crime scenes. Authorities discovered that he had a long criminal history and had been deported from the United States multiple times. But despite knowing his identity, capturing him proved extremely difficult. Reséndiz continued traveling along railroad lines, moving constantly between cities. Eventually, the Federal Bureau of Investigation placed him on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. His photograph was broadcast across television networks and newspapers. Communities near railroad yards were warned about the dangerous fugitive. The search for the railroad killer lasted several months. Then, in July 1999, something unexpected happened. Instead of being captured by police, Reséndiz surrendered voluntarily. Through negotiations with Texas law enforcement and the help of a religious leader, he agreed to turn himself in peacefully. He crossed the border from Mexico and was arrested by authorities in El Paso. His arrest ended one of the most frightening manhunts of the decade. Trial and conviction. During the trial, prosecutors presented extensive evidence connecting Angel Maturino Reséndiz to multiple murders. Investigators ultimately linked him to at least 15 killings across the United States. The crimes had occurred in several states, including Texas, Kentucky, Illinois, and California. The jury found him guilty. The court sentenced him to death. Execution. On June 27, 2006, Reséndiz was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. Before his execution, he expressed remorse and asked for forgiveness from the families of his victims. But for many families, the pain caused by his crimes could never fully be healed. Legacy of the case. The story of the railroad killer remains one of the most disturbing serial murder cases connected to Texas. His ability to travel secretly using freight trains made him extremely difficult to track. The case forced law enforcement agencies to reconsider how criminals could use transportation networks to move across the country undetected. Today, the crimes of Angel Maturino Reséndiz remain a chilling reminder that even ordinary places like quiet neighborhoods near train tracks can sometimes become the setting for terrible acts of violence. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 5. David Leonard Wood. During the late 1980s, a series of disappearances in El Paso created a growing sense of fear among residents. Young women began vanishing without explanation, and their families desperately searched for answers. At first, each case appeared unrelated, but as investigators began connecting the details, they realized that the disappearances might be linked to a single individual. The man eventually identified as the primary suspect was David Leonard Wood. His crimes would later become known as the Desert Killer Murders, one of the most disturbing serial murder cases in the history of Texas. Early life. David Leonard Wood was born in 1957 in San Angelo. From a young age, his life was marked by instability and criminal behavior. Records show that Wood began committing crimes while still a teenager. Over the years, he was arrested multiple times for offenses, including burglary and assault. His criminal history also included sexual offenses, which made him known to local law enforcement long before the murders that would later make national headlines. Despite his repeated arrests, Wood spent several periods living freely in communities across Texas. Eventually, he settled in El Paso, a large city located near the border between the United States and Mexico. The disappearances begin in 1987. Several young women disappeared from the El Paso area. Among the victims were Angelica Frosto, Lisa Renee, Ivy Williams. Many of the victims were last seen in public places such as shopping centers, bus stops, or convenience stores. Some witnesses later reported seeing the women speaking with a man shortly before they disappeared. At the time, police believed the disappearances might be connected to human trafficking or other crimes common near border regions. But soon, a far more disturbing possibility began to emerge. Discovery in the desert. The turning point in the investigation came when authorities began searching remote areas outside El Paso. These desert landscapes are vast and largely uninhabited. During one of the searches, investigators discovered human remains buried in shallow graves. The discovery shocked the community. Over time, additional bodies were found in the same area. Most of the victims were young women who had previously been reported missing. The remote desert location suggested that the killer had deliberately chosen an area where bodies might remain undiscovered for long periods of time. Because of these discoveries, the unknown suspect began receiving a terrifying nickname. The media started calling him the Desert Killer. Suspicion falls on David Wood. As the investigation continued, police began examining individuals who had prior criminal records in the region. One name repeatedly appeared during interviews with witnesses and former victims. That name was David Leonard Wood. Several women who survived encounters with Wood reported that he had approached them in public places and attempted to lure them into his vehicle. Some described narrowly escaping dangerous situations. These reports raised serious concerns among investigators. Police began closely monitoring Wood's activities. Eventually, authorities obtained a warrant to search his vehicle and personal belongings. During the investigation, they found evidence connecting him to several missing women. Arrest in 1987, David Leonard Wood was arrested and charged with multiple murders. The arrest attracted widespread media attention. Residents of El Paso were shocked to learn that a suspected serial killer had been living in their community. Families of the missing women hoped that the arrest would finally bring answers about what had happened to their loved ones. But the investigation and trial would take several years to unfold. The trial of David Leonard Wood began in the early 1990s. Prosecutors presented evidence showing that Wood had a long history of violence and had been connected to the disappearance of several women. Witnesses testified about encounters they had with him. Some described situations where Wood attempted to lure them into his car. Other evidence included items belonging to victims that were discovered during the investigation. Although the case relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, prosecutors argued that the pattern of disappearances and discoveries of bodies in the desert clearly pointed to Wood. The jury ultimately agreed. In 1992, David Leonard Wood was convicted of capital murder. The court sentenced him to death. Continued debate despite the conviction. The case remains controversial. Wood has consistently maintained his innocence. Over the years, his defense team has argued that the evidence used during the trial was insufficient to prove that he committed the murders. Supporters of Wood have called for new investigations and additional DNA testing. Meanwhile, prosecutors and many investigators remain confident that the evidence presented at trial was accurate. Because of these ongoing disputes, the case continues to attract attention from journalists, legal experts, and criminal investigators. Life on death row. After his conviction, Wood was transferred to the Pulaski unit, where he remains on death row. Years of appeals have delayed the execution process. Like many death penalty cases in the United States, the legal proceedings have taken decades to resolve. The impact on El Paso, the Desert Killer case, had a profound effect on the community of El Paso. For years after the murders, many residents remained fearful about safety in public places. Families of the victims continued seeking justice and remembrance for the young women whose lives had been lost. The crimes also forced law enforcement agencies to examine how missing person cases were handled, especially when victims came from vulnerable communities. Remembering the victims today, the story of the Desert Killer remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the criminal history of Texas. Whether viewed as a clear case of serial murder or a controversial conviction, the tragedy left a lasting mark on the families of the victims and the city where the crimes occurred. The desert outside El Paso still holds memories of the investigation that once brought national attention to the region, and the victims, young women whose lives ended far too soon, remain at the center of a story that continues to raise questions decades later. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary. Number 6. Billy Chemirmir. In the quiet suburbs of North Texas, a disturbing pattern began to emerge in the mid-2010s. Elderly women living in living communities were dying under mysterious circumstances. At first, the deaths did not appear suspicious. Many of the victims were elderly, and natural causes were often assumed. But as the number of cases grew, families began to notice troubling similarities. Jewelry was missing, personal belongings had disappeared, and the victims had often been alone when they died. Eventually, investigators uncovered a horrifying truth. A man named Billy Chemirmir had been targeting vulnerable elderly women in retirement communities across Texas. The crimes would become one of the most disturbing modern serial murder cases in the state. Early life: Billy Chemirmir was born in 1972 in Cabana. He later moved to the United States as an adult and eventually settled in the Dallas area. Chemirmir worked various jobs over the years, including positions as a caregiver and healthcare assistant. These jobs often brought him into contact with elderly individuals. To neighbors and acquaintances, he appeared quiet and unremarkable, but investigators later discovered that he had been living a secret life. The first suspicious deaths between 2016 and 2018. Several elderly women living in senior housing complexes in the Dallas area died unexpectedly. Many of these women lived in upscale retirement communities where residents expected to feel safe. Among the early victims were residents in facilities located in Plano and Dallas. At first, the deaths were ruled natural, but family members soon noticed something unusual. Valuable jewelry had disappeared from the victims' homes. Some relatives also questioned the sudden nature of the deaths. As more incidents occurred, suspicions slowly began to grow. A break in the case: the investigation changed dramatically in 2018. One evening, a resident at a senior living community in Plano encountered a suspicious man inside the building. The man claimed he was visiting someone, but when staff questioned him, his answers seemed inconsistent. Security contacted police. Soon afterward, officers detained the man. The suspect was Billy Chemirmir. At first, authorities suspected he might simply be a burglar, but when police searched his vehicle, they made a shocking discovery. Inside the car were pieces of jewelry belonging to multiple elderly women. Some of the jewelry had already been reported missing by families of women who had recently died. Investigators discover a pattern after Chemirmir's arrest. Detectives began reviewing earlier deaths of elderly residents across the Dallas area. They discovered a disturbing pattern. Many victims had lived in independent living communities where residents could come and go freely. Chemirmir had reportedly gained access to these buildings by pretending to be a maintenance worker or caregiver. Once inside, he would knock on doors and target elderly women who were alone. Investigators believe he then smothered the victims using pillows. Afterward, he stole jewelry and valuables before leaving the scene. Because the victims were elderly, their deaths were initially assumed to be natural. This allowed the killer to continue his crimes for years without immediate suspicion. The growing number of victims: as detectives investigated further, more cases were linked to Billy Chemirmir. Authorities eventually connected him to the deaths of at least 18 elderly women. The victims ranged in age from their 70s to over 90 years old. Many had lived independently and were beloved members of their communities. Families were devastated to learn that their relatives had not died from natural causes. Instead, they had been murdered by someone who deliberately targeted the most vulnerable members of society. The trial: the legal process against Chemirmir, became complex. Because of the large number of victims, prosecutors pursued multiple cases. In 2022, Chemirmir was tried for the murder of Lucy Harris, an 81-year-old woman who lived in Dallas. Prosecutors presented strong evidence connecting him to the crime, including stolen jewelry and witness testimony. The jury found him guilty. Chemirmir was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Prosecutors later dismissed additional cases because the life sentence ensured he would never be released. A shocking ending: despite the life sentence, the story took another unexpected turn. In September 2023, Billy Chemirmir was found dead inside his prison cell. He had been incarcerated at the Caulfield unit. Reports indicated that another inmate had attacked and killed him. The death brought a sudden end to the life of one of Texas's most disturbing modern serial killers. The impact of the case, the Chemirmir case, raised serious concerns about safety in retirement communities. Many facilities increased security measures, including improved visitor tracking and surveillance systems. Families also became more cautious about protecting elderly relatives living alone. The case demonstrated how vulnerable populations can sometimes become targets for criminals who exploit trust and isolation. Remembering the victims: although the killer is gone, the victims remain at the heart of the story. Each of the women had families, friends, and lives that were suddenly taken away. Their deaths served as a painful reminder of the importance of protecting elderly members of society. For many families in Texas, the tragedy will never be forgotten. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. For more deep dives into real-life crimes hidden behind power and faith, subscribe and stay tuned for our next investigative documentary.